Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari. We were having some problems with the internet gods. Apologies for the delays. Our guest today is Mr. Matthew Pauly. How are you doing, sir?
Very good, thank you, Payman. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited that you're here. You're going to be able to bring me up to speed on everything involved with Bill C-293 from soup to nuts. But before we get there, I thought maybe if you could tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. Okay. So I'm a retired software guy for 30 years, consulting to banks and insurance, financial institutions in general, and software vendors, and everything from, programming and design and team leading, and once the chief scientist of a publicly traded company with my intellectual property back in the 2000s. But anyway, so now since I guess around September 4th, going back a little bit, since 2020, it was apparent to me that there was some chicanery going on. This was definitely something strange, the way this whole pandemic thing was rolled out. And then September, the bills started coming out as well, right? Various bills from the government to do all kinds of kind of aggressive things to change Canada. And when I kind of, tried not to get too triggered, I signed a few petitions, and I also attended a number of, things at Queen's Park, a few of the peaceful assemblies and such. Then I also got involved in a few freedom groups, and it was just more of just a social thing. And it wasn't until September the 4th I saw Lisa Moran, who is a lawyer who really broke. Actually, it was Stephen Rogoski that first did the deep background research on C-293, and then Lisa got involved, and as a lawyer, started picking through it and starting to create sort of teaching materials. And so I saw her being interviewed on Laura Lynn TV around September 3rd, and I was just aghast at this bill. In only 5 pages, what it's trying to accomplish is just a massive amount of change of Canadian, standard of living, basically. And I decided this can't go. I can't let this go. Like, this is really bad. I mean, C-63 is bad enough, basically muzzling the Canadian population. Um, so it looked like I had to do something. So I dropped everything and said, okay, I'm going to get involved. And so I formed the Stop C-293 committee. I brought in my friend Robert, who was helping with the assistant of the producer of Laura Lynn TV. I also brought in that producer. And because she, of course, is constantly arranging interviews for people, we were able to set up Lisa Moran on a bunch of interviews. And within about 10 days, Lisa got 500 million views and broke Clout Hub when Todd Callender interviewed her. It was just like a huge amount of people that watched it. So that was a big success. And September 17th, we co-organized these rallies, where there were peaceful assemblies, both at Queen's Park in Toronto and also in front of the Senate courthouse in Ottawa, to bring people's attention to this rather overreaching bill, heinous bill, which would really be bad news for Canada. And so since then, we've been doing engagement on X with our Stop C-293 COMT account, COMTEE. So Stop C-293 COMT, COMTE. That's the X handle. And every week we do a show where we interview people, doctors and lawyers, and just people who are activists on 293. And we're very involved in driving traffic to that one-click site, which Prevent Genocide 2030, Dr. Lemo set up, which is a very significant thing because it allows people to just make a click and then put in a little information, and it, based on their postal code, hits all of the senators in their province with a nicely prepared letter, which you can actually edit yourself. And before I forget, the URL for that is stopc-293.ca, and that will take you there. There's over 300,000 letters that have been sent to Canadians, of the 105 senators, about this bill. And this is, I mean, I know for sure that I'm sure they would share with us their numbers, but in terms of previous campaigns, but I think it's a reasonable chance this is the largest ever engagement of the public to the Senate. They've literally, each one of them, received some of them thousands and thousands of letters. So the thing is, they're still going ahead with it so far, and we're kind of very concerned about that. It's in second reading, and the the thing is that the person who introduced it had 45 minutes to introduce it. They took 8 minutes, and they quoted the WEF philosopher, transhumanist Yuval
I hate
Harari.
that guy. I hate
Oh
that guy.
gosh, me too, me too. And I was really sad to see that he actually has a part-time home in Toronto. But anyway, this guy is just bad news, and he has this twisted view of humanity, and believes there are no such thing as human rights, and everything, what he says is just really shocking. And he's basically the right-hand man to Klaus Schwab, right? So it's just shocking to me. But anyway. So when they introduced the bill, the person, her name escapes me at the moment, but she's not as known as a senator having any big profile or anything. And anyway, so she just shut down all the questions that people had about it and said, well, look, this is I don't have any answers and no solutions. Has to go discussed in the committee. And people are standing up and saying, well, what about the agriculture association that's written the letters to you? What about all the farmers who are really upset? And she said, well, this will be for the committee. You have to get your witnesses, talk to the committee person, and get your witnesses submitted and such. So that was back in October, and nothing has happened in terms of progress. They actually have to go in in the Senate, and they have to say some magical words to officially refer it to committee. And then the clock starts ticking and it goes into committee. And that's the next stage. And what we're planning on doing is, of course, submitting a whole bunch of names of doctors and lawyers and National Citizens Inquiry testifiers to talk about what their experience was with the pandemic response that the government did. Anyway, so that's sort of where it's at, and we're kind of on top of it as much as we can be. It's very challenging to work with the Senate because their website is always 3/4 of a day out of date, and the senators are, of course, involved in lots of other bills, and they sometimes make mistakes like they're human. And we were on a wild goose chase about a week ago, being told that it had passed second reading and it was going to maybe go in third reading the next day. And then, of course, the senator's gone. It's end of day. We can't verify it on the website because it's 3/4 of a day before that comes, the new materials updated. And what are we going to do? Like, if we don't say anything and it goes into third reading the next day, and this is someone that we trusted, that we've been speaking with before. So we went live with it, and it created a lot of concern. We reached about between 35 and 40,000 Canadians, and they were all quite upset about it. And then the next day we did detailed investigations, including watching hours and hours of video of what had happened in the last few days and going through all their databases, and nothing happened. So the senator just made a mistake and confused us C-293 with another bill. But anyway, there's a lot of Canadians that are aware about this bill, and that's the good thing. I mean, to have that kind of engagement where we have 300,000 letters going to senators, that's a huge thing for Canada to be doing, or Canadians to be doing. So that's
why don't we
go ahead.
I was going to say, why don't we start with something not even related to the bill? You said that they got about 300,000 letters got sent to the senators.
Yes.
What's changed in our country that a senator or the Senate can receive 300,000 letters and then just say, nah, I'm not going to consider that. I'm just going to mule-headedly carry on?
Yes. What has changed in our country, and I will posit a guess. Our country right now is being run by a government that is essentially not loyal to Canadians. Let this clear one thing up. Our prime minister and the people in the cabinet don't take an oath to uphold the Constitution of Canada, like in a republic like the United States. They take an oath to respect the privacy and primacy of the Privy Council. The Privy Council, of course, reports essentially to the monarch and to the AG, but also to the monarch. And so anyway, as you know, our monarch, um, King Charles III, was present at the World Economic Forum to ring the ceremonial bell to introduce the Great Reset. Um, and his father, Philip, on his deathbed, made a comment about hoping he comes back as a deadly virus. So that gives you an idea of the attitude, the sort of eugenicist attitude of his father. And it's not just, that person. Obviously, that's going to influence their children. And if we look around the world, royalty and super wealthy people, billionaires, not all of them, but some of them are of this mindset. They belong, some of them, to the Bilderberg Group and other groups that are kind of secret societies, and they were, since they brought the 1880s, approached with this ideology in book form about how there was too many people in the world, and a lot of them believe this, and this is absolute nonsense. And unfortunately, in the media, it's been picked up because, of course, our liberal media is highly concentration owned, and of course, the government is giving them $500 million in sort of pandemic help or something. We're not quite sure. It's to the point where the Toronto Star, half of their staff writers' salaries is being from the money they're getting from the federal government. So the media is basically believes and is playing this UN agenda that there's too many people in the world, and the world is we have global boiling, and it's we're on the cusp of the sinking of islands, nations, from the oceans rising. This has been going on for a long time. The problem is that human beings, as we know, are um, have some vulnerabilities, and that is that if you repeat a message over and over to them in the media, over and over and over and over and over, and it's repeated a long time, they tend to believe it. And unfortunately, I actually 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I used to watch the CBC. I mean, I grew up. My father was a very liberal left anthropologist and sociologist, quite left guy. In fact, I grew up in a very left household, and we had CBC playing, 24/7 just about. And I even campaigned for the NDP as a young guy in first year of university and on the break, and like door to door, actually, in 2 elections. And once I actually even campaigned for the Liberals for like one day. Because my best friend's father was a very senior guy in Trudeau's cabinet back in the 70s. But when I saw what was going on in the last 10 years or so, I realized, no, 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 this is not right. The way that the whole thing is going with teaching people that there's too many people on the earth, and that's causing, destruction of the entire ecosystem. This is nonsense. This is propaganda, and this is actually relevant to C-293, because this thing is only 5 pages, and it's, of course, it's French and English, and it never once mentions climate change, but you can see it's just oozing from the edges of the words in the way this is written, that this is all about climate change. They're promoting the idea, because the UN is saying this, of course, that the problem is the climate is warming really fast, and that's causing animals to be migrating to the poles, to get away from the heat. And then the migrating animals are carrying, diseases.
Avian bird flu, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. So that's really causing pandemics, right? And that therefore we're in grave danger of pandemics. And I've looked a lot. I mean, I'm kind of a sciencey nerd, and I've been studying this whole thing since 2020 in great detail. And there's a lot of things about this that are complete. Well, the vast majority of it is completely bunk. It's false. We don't even have an isolated virus. In fact, the whole field of virology is very questionable. They have this Cox postulates. There are 4 things. You've got to isolate the thing and then show that the person that's got the same disease over here, you isolate it as well, and you you then try and infect, and see that you can, just by getting a little bit of this infected stuff and then putting in the other person, that they're going to get. None of this stuff has been done with viruses. The whole thing is very, very questionable. And for COVID-19, well, first of all, SARS-CoV-2 is what its actual name is. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit. Let me just back up a little bit. First, to talk about the bill, let's just ask the question. That this bill is called the Pandemic Prevention or Preparedness and Prevention Act. Okay, and this comes out in like 2022, and it's written by this Erskine Smith guy who's a vegetarian and a vegan, and there's 3 clauses in it that are basically heavily regulating animal agriculture. And one of them even talks about getting rid of high-risk species. Now, this is from the perspective of pandemics. So what are high-risk species? Well, I can just imagine, right? I mean, you've got birds get sick and they get avian flu. So therefore, birds are high-risk species. What about, pigs, swine flu? Maybe they're high-risk species. And it goes on and on. And we know that they have already stated that they want people to not eat meat. They're saying that eating meat causes vast amounts of CO2 release. And so it's right there in the bill. There's 3 clauses of basically heavily regulating and all but shutting down commercial animal agriculture. Oh, and getting rid of live animal markets. So imagine you're a farmer, and farmers, they have to constantly get in new genetic livestock because you don't want to have interbreeding, right? You want to have new genes come in. Well, how do they get them? They go to these auctions, right? At these fairs and stuff, and they bring in live animals, and they get to look at them, and they can lead them around by the halter, and then people bid on them. It's an auction. You have none of that. If this bill goes through, you're not going to be able to go to a live auction to buy animals. Well, how is that going to? That has a massive impact now on commercial animal agriculture in Canada. And finally, there's another on this topic of getting rid of meat. There's a whole clause about promoting alternative proteins. Alternative proteins. Well, yeah. First of all, you've got synthetic meat, right? And there's 2 flavors of that. There's, of course, the stuff that's made out of 3D printers, and it's seed oil based, and we know seed oils are very bad for humans. We never evolved to eat seed oils, and it causes long-term inflammation, and we know what long-term inflammation causes. It causes cancer. So the second kind of synthetic meat is bioreactor meat, where they essentially get cells that continuously grow and divide and never stop dying. Well, that is a tumor. You're essentially eating a giant tumor if you buy that kind of meat. And there's no safety studies. There's no way this is going to be healthy for us. Why do I know that? Because, I mean, first of all, the science is not done on this in terms of long-term safety. They just invented this bioreactor meat. But I mean, it's just intuitively obvious. If you're eating something that's essentially a large tumor, it's probably not that good for you. And the kind of meat that's good for you is muscle meat, right? Anyway, this whole thing about getting rid of agriculture is really offensive, and the idea that they're going to force Canadians into eating synthetic meat and insect protein is just unacceptable. Unacceptable. And of course, they've got that plant that the federal government just a few years ago invested, was it $8.5 million near London, Ontario, and all it does is make crickets, and like millions of crickets in a week or a day or something. And apparently, it's on hard times. They've been putting it in pet food, but not enough people are buying it. The manufacturers are buying it, so they had to scale it down considerably. Anyway, so that's the thing about the commercial animal agriculture itself, which is really upsetting. But even before you get into this, if you're still in 2022, this started, you're still in the pandemic technically. So if you were in a pandemic and you were concerned that you felt you needed better pandemic plans, what would you do? Probably you would look and see, let's do a review of our pandemic performance so far. Let's see how this really worked out, making everyone wear masks and stand 6 feet apart and isolate in their homes, right? Not getting any sunshine and fresh air. Healthy people, and watch nonstop television, which has got, like, CNN has a death counter in the top left-hand corner, live 24/7 for months. So, you'd look at the pandemic response and you'd say, what worked, what didn't work? And for example, they could look at the National Citizens Inquiry results. And there's a lot of information from a lot of Canadians in that inquiry. And that was all organized by citizens. No, they didn't do any of that. They came out with this canned idea, which I do not believe for a moment that Erskine Smith wrote this whole thing. This is like had to be straight out of the WHO. And basically, he just customized a few things to make it look Canadian or something. So this thing calls for a One Health approach. This is something that comes from both the UN and the WHO. The One Health approach is a multi-sectorial and multidisciplinary collaborative approach that focuses on the human, animal, plant, and ecosystem health and welfare interface is central to preventing the risk of future pandemics. By the way, welfare interface, that's referring to people's interactions with the government, which sort of puts us into that kind of this weird that they think that welfare is really our interaction with the government. But anyway, the thing about that is the scope of this collaborative multi-sectoral approach is humans, animals, plants, and ecosystem health and the welfare interface. What activities do we do every day that are not involving, humans, animals, plants, and ecosystem health? I mean, that's everything. And the welfare interface means everything that you do interacting with the government. It's the scope of this is so broad, this One Health approach. What it does is it essentially gives the UN and the WHO the hooks into every sector of the economy. Every activity that people are engaged in is now going to be regulatable with this pandemic prevention plan. So this is the first thing that's just atrocious. And also, humans and animals and plants are all the same value. Now this goes back to these people at Davos and such. I mean, they do not value humans very much, and so that's a concern.
Let me jump in. There's a
Yeah.
lot there. So first of all, RB Ham is a former guest. So apparently, he's a huge fan of yours. So thank you, Mr. Ham. Well, my question is, the World Pandemic Treaty, the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty, and the IHR International Health Regulations. I look at this and I feel like they failed to get that through at the international level. They're like, why don't we just do it federally? How far off am I?
Well, yes, you're bang on in the sense that here's a slight twist on that. When military are waging a war, they have multiple redundant kill vectors, right? And they'll have to adjust, like maybe one won't quite have the desired result based on where the enemy is and that kind of thing. So they'll use the other kill vector. So that anytime they have multiple kill vectors lined up. Well, if you're trying to wage a depopulation war on the human race and get rid of all but 500 million people, you have to have a multiple kill vectors going. And so this legislation, C-293, is essentially, as you say, that so they've got this other way of coming in at the treaty level with the the WHO amendments and the WHO pandemic treaty and the pandemic agreement, and then they've got the pact for the future. And what happens if that negotiation doesn't go the way they want? Well, they've got to have another way of getting this stuff in, and that's where 293 comes in, because in this horrible clause 3NO, which to me is the most worst part of this whole bill. This is right here. Set out in consultation with relevant ministers a summary of key cooperative measures or agreements on disease outbreak prevention and preparedness between the Government of Canada, other foreign governments, and key international organizations, including the World Health Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Well, there you go. So they're saying that Canada has to basically, in consultation with relevant ministers, a summary of key cooperative measures or agreements on disease outbreak prevention and preparedness between the Government of Canada, other foreign governments, and WHO. Okay, Doesn't that sound an awful lot like the WHO pandemic treaty and pandemic agreement and amendments? Of course it does. That's exactly what it is. This
You know,
now, this clause will bring that in.
what really tipped me off is that these little buzzwords like One Health approach, whole of government, whole of society. I don't know if it's in there, but ecosystem services. I hear these things. I'm like, yeah, these are nutcase, lunatic, leftist, globalist,
Oh yeah.
WEFers.
Oh yeah. Whenever they start writing it, it starts to look like an ideological paper. You know they're up to no good. Because you know what? This is overkill. Let me just jump out of this C-293 directly for a second here. We in my lifetime in Ontario. I mean, I was born actually in Ontario, but I grew up in Saskatchewan, and my father was at the University of Saskatchewan for a long time. And we've had two basic, pandemics. I mean, not including 1969, the Woodstock thing, which really didn't make it up to Canada very much. They had the Woodstock. There was some sort of a serious flu that happened, but basically the big one was in 2003 SARS, right? And then of course, well, to the extent that there was any pandemic, COVID. Now let's look at the actual technical names: SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. Why are they so close? Because they're both gain of function patented bioweapons, and they were both leaked from labs. So if you're going to be concerned about preparing for pandemics and preventing pandemics, how about addressing that problem? How about pulling all the funding from level 4 and level 3 bioweapons labs, which are essentially an arms race? It's replacing, as of around 2000, biological weapons have now become the new nuclear, arsenal idea, and it's horrific. It's called dual use research. And what they do is they say, well, if it's dual usage, so we're creating a gain of function virus, we're passing it through animal models and such to make it so that it'll actually, target the ACE2 receptor on a mouse that we've grafted, maybe a humanized mouse. And these ACE2 receptors, are human ones. And so we gradually, breed this virus, get it in, going through all these mice and making them sick. That's what they did for SARS, okay? And then they say, well, we're going to actually develop this bioweapon, but we're going to make a vaccine for it. So that'll be good. But the whole idea is absolutely insane. So what you're doing is you're funding billions of dollars in these hundreds of these research labs around the world, tinkering with deadly pathogens to try and make them more deadly, with the idea, so you're having an arms race now, with the idea that, well, if we get a vaccine for it, then if the enemy comes up with the same exact one, we'll already have a vaccine ready, which is like, crazy. That doesn't make sense. And the risks that you do, of course, you're into an arms race now. And also you have these things are extremely dangerous, and you can have leaks. And that's what happened. SARS-CoV-1, which was called SARS, was in Toronto and in China. That was a bioweapon. And SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 one, is also a bioweapon. So if you really want to do something about pandemics and write a paper, a law to get rid of them, this should say remove all funding from bioweapon labs, and have Canada get the signatories of the anti-biological weapons treaty to re-sign a tighter treaty and make these things illegal and stop doing this, because that would stop the pandemics. We wouldn't have had these pandemics if that was the case. No. So what do they do instead? This law says no. Pandemics are caused by global warming and by our freedoms. It's our freedoms that are causing the problem. It's because we're traveling and we're getting our cars and we drive around, and we have farmers that are living on the edge of wildlands where there's wild animals. So that's an interface for wild animals to infect the farm people, and then we'll have a pandemic. So there's actually a clause in here about changing land use. So why do they need to change land use? Well, what they want to do is the entire borders of agricultural areas that are against forests or wildlands, they're going to evict. They will, of course, evict all the farmers because they believe that this is how we're getting pandemics. This is crossing over from wild animals. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is, tick-borne diseases. Well, the Lyme disease wasn't a problem until the Plum Island bioweapons lab came out with an enhanced version of this bacteria that was whatever it was, mites or something that were on the lice, sorry, on the ticks that caused Lyme disease. And now the number of ticks that now have Lyme disease in the States and in Canada is like gargantuanly, like orders of magnitude higher than ever before. That's the classic case of something coming across from animals. But last time I heard, no one has died from a deer-borne illness, and geese and stuff like that. It's just nonsense. So they're really going after. They're really just using fear of pandemics, because let's not forget, they scared the daylights out of people on purpose. It was a mind control operation. To get back to this thing I was telling you about, the CNN counter at the top of the screen. So what they did in February, March, when they started the lockdown thing, is they used what the KGB and the CIA learned in the 1960s, that if you confine people so that they're socially isolated, and you play them nonstop fear propaganda day in and day out, and they did. Remember, they told us from Professor Ian Ferguson of the University College of London, this terrible guy who does these computer modeling, and he won't show his data, won't show his software. And he's the WHO go-to guy when they want to do a pandemic. And he models things that have orders of magnitude more. He said it was going to be 3.4% mortality. So you're telling people they shouldn't go outside, because if they catch this virus, there's a 3.4% chance they're going to die. He was off by 1,000-fold. Okay, the lethality of this thing was the same as a seasonal flu, a bad seasonal flu year. We have them every 3 or 4 years. We have a bad seasonal flu year, about that much. But no, they told people that they went outside, they had a 3.4% chance of dying potentially, and then so they're all socially isolated. And this is exactly what they do to prisoners, in these prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, when they want to extract confessions or supposedly break them, is you socially isolate them, and then you fear them, nonstop fear messaging all day long, and eventually the human beings succumb, and they now start to believe what they're told. And this is what happened in 2021, in 2020 rather. It was very tragic. It was a mass mind control operation, and it worked. It scared people so badly that they decided that they would come out every day. This was all planned. We had in Ontario, our Premier Ford would come out about 10:30 every morning, and he'd say, well, on the pandemic thing, everybody, try, it's pretty scary what's going on, but if you just follow these little rules, 6-foot distancing, and make sure you're wearing the masks, and sometimes 2 layers, and make sure you don't have any friends over. You gotta really think about the kids. Think about the old people too. You got to keep the kids from the old people, because they're all silent spreaders, those kids. And all this propaganda, and then he said, in his sonorous voice, but it's all going to be okay, because the vaccines are going to come out, and if you just do what we say, it's going to be fine. And then at 11 o'clock or so, then of course, twinkle toes, fancy socks, Trudeau would come out in front of his taxpayer paid for, beautiful house, and stand out there and talk about how scary the pandemic was. But if you just follow these things, the same thing essentially as Ford was saying. And what happened was, every day they would come out and they'd use this sonorous voice, like a father figure voice, and try and sort of comfort people at the end. And what happens is, when human beings have been frightened so badly, and they're told that by someone over and over again that this is how it is, you're going to be safe if you do what I say, you start to be sympathetic with your captor, which is otherwise known as Stockholm syndrome. And so every day that they went out there, they were increasing their public popularity, because people looked to them for hope that he's going to take care of us. He's going to take care of us. It was a classic mind control operation, which worked because people lined up for the testing. And we know about the testing, these PCR tests. Let's not forget the guy who invented them, Kerry Mullis, who was publicly attacking Fauci a lot, and suddenly died just before this thing started. Kerry Mullis said this is never to be used for diagnosing illness. You can't diagnose illness. And by the way, you can make the thing find any molecule in anybody, because if you just crank up the cycle thresholds, it's like a non-linear thing. You're doubling the number of magnifications. It's like taking a Xerox and photocopying something, taking the photocopied copy part, taking the copy and then photocopying that, and then taking that copy and then photocopying that. And you've done that on the machine. What happens is you start to see speckles and stuff. Well, it's the same thing. If you do like a 40 cycle threshold PCR test, which is what the WHO thing was, that was 97% or 98%, 97.3, I think, percent false positive. So basically, people were lining up because they were so frightened that they had COVID because the new variant has come out. Oh, Omega, and all these Delta and Beta and all these variants, which were all made up. And what happened was people were so frightened they went out and got these tests done. And what would they do? All these false positives would happen, right? And then what would happen is the counts would be so high. And then because the counts were so high and yet people were suddenly dying, well, how come the death counts were so high? Well, they went into old folks' homes and they just did horrible things. I mean, horrible things. I mean, we had the military had to go in Ontario and look at these old folks' home because doctors and the care workers had left, and these people were found abandoned essentially. They did things like they cleared out the ICU ward at the hospital, the oldest, sickest people, and they send them into an old folks' home. So, in the terrain theory of disease modeling, if you've got a whole bunch of dry tinder in the forest and you introduce a spark, wow, you're going to have massive casualties. And that's what they did. They had all these old sick people, and then they introduced someone from the ICU that was very sick with some respiratory illness, and all these people would start passing away. And of course, what they did is they socially isolated them. You couldn't even visit your grandparents in there, right? And that makes them feel depressed, and they can't go outside, so they can't get vitamin D from the sun. It's a perfect storm. And then, of course, they introduced the protocol, right? Midazolam, and then it's a respiratory suppressant, right? And it calms you down and everything. And then they give them morphine, whether or not they had pain. And the number of people who died suddenly in these old folks' home was just horrific. And then they PCR test them and say, oh, it's COVID. And so we have all these death counts that are coming up. So now you've got people lining up to take all these tests, which is creating all these test cases. And then you have all these people dying in the old folks' homes. And let's not forget the hospitals. They withheld early treatments. Doctors are not allowed to prescribe things that we knew. I mean, coming out of SARS in 2003, we knew that ivermectin or HCQ was highly recommended. No, they banned all that because they couldn't get the emergency use authorization to actually have the experimental vaccines used unless there was no therapies. So they published these fraudulent studies in these big medical journals, which were since rescinded, but that was enough that they could get the FDA to give them their emergency use authorization. And so basically, they're withholding early treatments. So people are getting sick and they're not getting treated from their doctors. And if their doctors try and treat them, they get big trouble from their college. And if they wrote vaccine exemptions, of course, they could lose their license. So people were supposed to stay at home, socially isolated, no vitamin D, no exercise, getting fear messaging. So of course they got sick because your immune system needs to be challenged constantly to stay up, into shape. Just like if you don't do any exercise, you're gradually going to get sicker and weaker and stuff, right? So then you're supposed to stay at home if you get sick and no early treatment. Just take Tylenol until you get blue lips. In other words, until you're like you're having trouble breathing. Then you get shipped off to the hospital, and what do? They PCR test you. Oh, it's COVID, and then you get literally restrained.
I remember I got into a fight with and I never do this, but I was in the room with my father and his doctor, and I couldn't get a straight answer out of this guy. I was like,
Yeah.
At what point, what should I do with my father if he gets COVID? He's like, don't worry about it. Just, take him to the hospital. I'm like, okay, do I take him to the hospital before or after he dies? And there was this tense moment where me and him were just staring at each other in the lab, the clinic. And basically what he was saying is, I'm the doctor. I'm the anointed one. I'm the expert. How dare you question me? And I wanted to punch him in the face, be like, you're not a doctor, man. I'm your customer. The customer is always right. Like, do your goddamn job.
I agree, and it was just horrific. And I was very lucky. I had a doctor that was very enlightened, and in March of that year, he sent around an article to all of his patients from the Journal of Orthomolecular Medicine saying, to support your immune system, you should be taking these 5 nutraceuticals, which are vitamins and minerals, vitamin D, zinc, quercetin, selenium, magnesium, and you take this every day, and it'll make sure your immune systems are in good shape. And so anyway, most doctors were not that way. And what happens is doctors suddenly found themselves in position of great power. And well, we know about the Milgram experiments, which were sponsored by the CIA, where they put people in white lab coats and then they were fake doctors, and they had an actor behind a glass screen that was wired to this sort of electrical machine, and then they had the person saying, the doctor's telling them, read them these questions, and they have to get the right answers. And then of course they give wrong answers because they're an actor actually, but they don't know that, right? The person sitting in the chair, they crank up the the electricity more and more until basically the person is screaming in pain and saying, it's my heart, I don't think I'm gonna live. And and the doctor would say, but more, turn it up more. And they'd turn it up to like over 250 volts. And the person would just fake death at this point. And 67% of the people would do it just because someone in a white lab coat told them. So you got to remember that human beings, like again, I said, we're vulnerable, and we're vulnerable to manipulation. And so what we had was doctors were told by their hospitals that they're getting so much money for doing these following things. You have to give someone this PCR test. And then if you refer them to the COVID floor, hey, that's another $5,000, for the hospital. And then if you then give them remdesivir, oh, that's another 20 grand. Well, let's get clear. The protocol in the hospitals was remdesivir, which was 53% mortality. It was an experimental drug that Bill Gates owned. It was only ever used in a trial in Africa for treating like Ebola. And can you believe it? They actually had to stop the trial for that drug, but the rest of the Ebola drugs they didn't stop because it was killing 53% of the people. That's what they were giving people in the hospital for COVID.
Can I
Nothing like. Go
let
ahead.
me ask you a question because before we move on, um, I really feel like we don't live in a free market economy anymore, and we've moved into like a fascism or corporatism where you got this
Absolutely.
oligopoly or like straight up monopolies, like the College of Physicians. What
Absolutely.
tell me, and I want your honest opinion. What do you think has happened? Do you think that this was inevitable when we started creating these colleges and regulating through these bodies, or do you think that we took our eye off the ball and we've allowed these regulatory bodies to be captured?
Well, my theory is as follows. Apparently, the charter for the Chartered Accountants Associations is actually in the city of London. And I'm not talking about London, UK. I'm talking about a square mile or so inside of London, which is called the City of London. And it's got its own police force, its own constitution, and it is all the international bankers. And they have the charter for all the chartered accountants. So why wouldn't they have the charters for all the doctors' regulatory colleges? Because every single one in North America and throughout Europe as well, were all coercing doctors to give no early treatment for COVID, to not give anybody ivermectin under any circumstances, or HCQ, hydrochloroquine, not to say anything bad about the vaccines. In fact, anything that you say that increases the vaccine's hesitancy, we can investigate you and you can lose your license. So why is it that every doctor's regulatory college has been persecuting doctors all across the country here in Canada and in the States? In fact, I've been watching it closely, and it affected even my own doctor. And so I think it's because those institutions were taken long ago. I think that the international banking community in the City of London's got the charters for every one of them. And also Big Pharma, if you think about it, Big Pharma, how did Big Pharma start, right? You're familiar with Rockefeller Medicine, right? And Rockefeller was the world's first billionaire. And back in the 1920s or so, he decided that we would get, he had all this petroleum refining going on, and he discovered you could make molecules out of it. And so he went and he bribed all of the medical schools in North America and in Europe. And he said, but I'll give you this money to help you because I'm really concerned about health. But I need to see it on your board. And he put one of his people on the board. And then once he got only some of the money up front, he said, now you want the other $1 million? We have to change the whole curriculum here. And now all natural medicine can't be shared. There's only, none of the alternative medicine. Well, back then that was the mainstream medicine, right? We were animals and plants were medicine. And that's how we evolved, right? The best medicines have always been that way. And they made it so only allopathic medicine is allowed, which is single molecule solutions. So anyway, the whole big pharma has been captured, and big pharma is so wealthy that this lobby is the biggest lobby in Washington, and um, the combined profits of all of the, or is it maybe the capitalization of all of the big pharma companies would make it in the top 20 of the GDP of a country. This would be like a top 20 country. That's how powerful they are. So I believe big pharma had a lot of influence on all those doctor regulatory colleges, just like they have all the influence on all the hospitals who actually did this death protocol in the hospitals that the government did.
Another praising comment from Mr. Ham. This guy knows his stuff. Let's
Thank you.
dip a toe into the world of conspiracy theory. These big pharma, BlackRock, Vanguard, are these just like different funds or different companies that are owned by the banks?
Well, I mean, technically, right? They're just giant holding companies that in State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, of course, is the kingpin. They own basically all the major companies. They're in the top 3 or 4 of all the major big corporations. Um, and who owns those, right? And then we
That's what
find
I'm
out there's
asking.
cross ownership. There's cross ownership. What I've heard is Vanguard is the only one that you can't find out who owns it. So I suggest that's where the people who print all the money, the international bankers, actually, but they probably own Vanguard, but we don't know. But you know what? We don't even have to get into conspiracy theory. This bill, C-293, if this thing becomes law, we will essentially. This is really important. The amendment at the very end here, amendment to the Department of Health Act. And here it creates a national coordinator, pandemic prevention and preparedness. For the purposes of coordinating the activities under the Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness Act, the minister shall appoint a national pandemic prevention and preparedness coordinator from among the officials of the Public Health Agency of Canada, PHEC. That's where Theresa Tam is from. Oh, guess what? The UN Satellite Office for Canada in Washington, D.C., on their website lists PHAC as in their portfolio. What does it mean in your portfolio? A portfolio is what an artist carries around the samples of his work, you know? And so they're basically saying they have ownership of PHAC, which is no surprise. Look at Theresa Tam. She's a complete who person, right? So this pandemic coordinator is essentially a czar. And this is the thing that's really important here. It says that um, the minister will appoint this person from the PHEC and then delegate to the coordinator the powers, duties, and functions that the minister considers appropriate. And this whole bill, unlike almost all legislation, has no definition of terms. Appropriate. Well, appropriate is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. So whatever the minister wants to do, it's unlimited. Now, what powers does the minister have? Well, they have a lot of powers. Now, in both in Western Australia and in New Zealand, they went down this road with similar legislation. And what did it end up being? It ended up being that they awarded police and military force to be used to enforce medical orders by the head chief medical officer, in this case, what we call this pandemic preparedness, actually it's called prevention and preparedness coordinator. They swapped the words around. The act is the preparedness and prevention, but this coordinators, they swap the words around. Why did they do that? Because if it starts with prevention, it means that their powers now are always there, even if there's no declared pandemic. Anyway, that's a side point. So why is this person, this czar, given all this power? It's because they will be able to press a button, and then across Canada, all the different health departments will now be using force of police and military to quarantine even healthy Canadians. Because all they got to do is say, well, you were at your cell phone indicates, because it pinged the tower, you were at such a location in this intersection, last week on a Wednesday. And it turns out that somebody at that intersection later had a PCR test and it said that they had bird flu. So I'm afraid we have to take you. Even though you're looking fine, you're healthy, the police are at your door and they are taking you away. And they'll take you to a quarantine facility. And once there, this is in the law in New Zealand, They will administer by force a preventative medicine. What does that mean? That means an experimental mRNA jab, right? Well, the word is out that last year, when the U.S. bought 4 million doses of this avian flu vaccine, the whistleblower doctors that I've seen said that it's 40 times more lethal in terms of severe adverse events than the COVID-19 jab. So
That's just crazy.
essentially, these are essentially depopulation weapons, just as the whole COVID thing
Okay,
was.
Matthew, let's we got to start winding the show
Yes,
down. So I want to broaden the scope. I'm gonna fire us a
yeah,
couple of bills at you,
sure.
and I'll
Oh
briefly
no.
explain them for the audience.
Okay.
So you have Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act. It's for podcasters regulating them. Bill
Hmm.
C-18, the Online News Act for regulating news on social media or online. The Bill C-63, the Online Hate Act, which basically is this like tyrannical bill that regulates
Yes.
everything you say.
Yes.
In BC, we have the BC Mental Health Act. 30,000 people a year in BC are forcibly detained, and then some of them are medicated, and they've used it against
Mm.
whistleblowers.
Yes, they
Um,
have.
so,
Yes.
so we're all kind of looking at this, and Bill S-275, which is they're trying to take over the banking system, making it so we can never take back our bank, get a state sovereign bank.
Yes.
That's kind of unknown, but it's all heading towards slavery.
And the
And,
big
and
pharma bill, they take away the natural health products. You
Oh
have
yeah,
to,
that
yeah,
was in the budget bill, the normalization, and Bill
yeah.
C-293. You've been talking. So let's say we're going to slavery, and let's say the bankers are behind this. What I can't understand is, like, do the bankers go to these legislators? And I'm running for federal office, but do they go to them and show a picture of their daughter and be like, sign this bill, or we're gonna go visit Nancy at school, and you'll never see her again? Like, how are they? How do legislators hate their country so much that they're pushing this stuff?
Um, Human beings are vulnerable to coercion, and the people that typically are doing it are not the bankers, but that would be the people in the government that work in the intelligence agencies that essentially are part of the whole thing. And therefore, these people are experts at administering coercion. Um, and threatening of family is, in fact, one of the things. The classic one, of course, is they'll drug them, put something in the drink in a bar, and it'll be essentially a date rape drug, like one of these things like that makes it so you have no willpower. And then they'll lead, and a beautiful woman, if it's a guy, will then lead them back to a hotel room. And then they'll put them in bed and they'll be all high and they won't even be present. And then they'll stick a child in the bed naked. And then they'll wait till it falls asleep. And then they'll come in and they'll just, with the camera and the lights, and they'll just lift up the sheet and then bang, get the picture. And it won't be photoshopped. It'll be legit, right? So doing this kind of thing to politicians has been going on a long time, and a lot of the politicians, like, look at our peer, Justin Trudeau. I'm sure they've got lots on him, right? And there's all kinds of, he's had to pay off, what is it, $2 million to shut up a child that he was responsible for as a teacher that was like 14 years old, and he was caught in the basement by the father. And I mean, the amount of video they must have on this guy is huge. Not to mention when he was at that Brebeuf College out there in BC, which is only a mile and a bit from
I
Piggy's
think it's
Palace.
West Point Grey Academy in Spanish Banks,
Oh yeah, well
Vancouver.
there was a couple. There was maybe more than one. Yeah. Um, so anyway, the amount of stuff they've got on politicians is huge. And therefore, yes, I think there is coercion, blackmailing, and there's coercion, threatening, even to threaten family, and what else? Money. People are paid money, right? And they can become. Why is it, for example, that we're seeing people in office like, let's look at Trudeau when he came into office versus where he is now? I mean, it's hard to get validation on it, but we're looking at orders of magnitude, like from like couple million to like add zeros, 2 zeros kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
that's just not practical. Like, if I gave you $1 million today, it'd be very difficult for you in 10 years to turn that into $100 million. Like you
Absolutely.
probably you
Yeah.
might end up with less,
Yeah.
if you're lucky, you'll give it to a bank, you'll get maybe 10 million if you're lucky.
Well, we see what's happened in the States with Nancy Pelosi and these other people who are, clearly doing insider trading, right? There's all that going on too. But anyway, so the thing is that this bill, if this goes through, Canadians need to realize that there's been a whistleblower at the WHO, Stuckelberger, I believe it is. And she has been a virologist there for 10 years, and she came out and publicly said they've got 10 years of pandemics lined up for us, or 10 years of serious infectious diseases. And if we don't get out of the WHO and out of the UN, we are going to be enslaved, and we're going to be dispossessed of our wealth. We're going to be dispossessed of our health, and our children are going to have no future. And we're going to end up living in the 15-minute cities with this bill. When it talks about expropriating, it's called changes in land use. That means taking all those people that are in cottages. You're going to have a nice cottage, if you're really successful. Well, guess what? You're going to lose that. And if you've got a residence rural, you end up in the city, in the 15-minute city, about where I am right now. I'm in the center of Canada's largest city, literally the geographical center, Yonge and Eglinton, and living in a condo, stacked and surrounded by stacks, the tallest buildings, all full. And this is like a 15-minute city here, right? And this is what they're going to want for everybody. And not to mention there's 5G towers all over the place, which we know is actually extremely dangerous. And there's heavy metal coming in all the time from, aerial spraying for weather modification purposes. And that gets in our bodies, which means we're very vulnerable to 5G. So there's multiple kill vectors, as I was talking. But just this bill alone, this would make things really, really bad for our health, and it's going to force us to suffer pandemics and force us, by this amendment to the Health Act, which is here, to actually be forced into quarantine, forced to take medication that is obviously going to be unsafe.
So let me share some of my thoughts.
Mhm,
Um, every like Getting out of the UN, that would be great.
absolutely required.
It's necessary, but what I mean is it's not sufficient, because we have a lot of stupid people at home. So people who believe that climate change is man-made, and that we're all going to die unless we pay carbon tax, like that is homegrown, and we have to tackle that. People
We
that support
do.
this bill,
We
we have to
do.
tackle that. And like we're going to spend the rest of our lives essentially like we have to homeschool, re-educate. we,
Yes.
we got to get these goddamn law societies under control, the judges. This is a lifetime endeavor.
Well, if it's absolutely possible to do, if we get um, a non-uniparty candidate leader, uh, like from the People's Party of Canada, for example. Well, that's the only example that exists right now. Our committee, we're kind of like apolitical, but we're trying to, our entire focus is to stop this nonsense. And we've looked at all the candidates, and there's only one who's willing to say we will pull out of the UN at least all of our money. We're not going to pay them anything. Same thing with World Economic Forum. Same thing with the WHO. No money goes to them. And the just question remains: do you actually remain sort of as an observer or not? And because as he brought up in the interview, that we don't know what the consequences are yet of actually pulling out of those organizations completely. But we're certainly not going to have any of their agendas. And that's quite simple. If he was in power, he could pass a law that says, guess what? All you bureaucrats in the federal government, no one is allowed to use the in fact, I would like you to take all of your handbooks that are from the UN on how you're supposed to do your job, and these public-private partnership stuff from the WEF. All these handbooks, please serve them into this garbage room in your building, and sign that you've handed them over, because they're all going in the garbage. No one is going to pull any UN, any WEF, any WHO policies again on our country, and we now have to re-educate people, like start with the kids, obviously, and take out all the DEI stuff and all that stuff, and then try and help people that are obviously they're believing falsehoods. Particularly the global warming one. The CBC has been playing that
Yeah,
day in
yeah.
and day out for like 2 decades, and it's really harmful, because with that Mark Twain thing, you know, it's so really, how's the saying go? Something like,
Oh, it's easier to dupe someone than to convince them that they've been duped, something like that. Trick
exactly,
someone.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly the quote. Yeah, yeah. That's the problem. but it is possible to bring people awareness and do it over time in a way that's very humane. And what you're really doing is saying, look, here's all the evidence, and we're just going to show it to you, and because it's important, and I actually believed this stuff like 15, 20 years ago. I was really believing that if we kept eating beef, that would be the end of the Amazon. And no, it won't. The reason that they're clearing the Amazon is they're having major economic problems there. And by the way, those aren't the lungs of the planet. It turns out the lungs of the planet are the plankton in the ocean. Um, so anyway, the amount of propaganda and just outright lies. For example, remember the hockey stick graph? Who was before John Kerry? The other
Al
climate,
Gore.
Al Gore. They actually made this graph. And it was like a hockey stick of the level of temperature, and it suddenly went up like this. And because they took out a section of data where it wobbled a bit, because they want a nice straight line and hockey stick up. They give us
Yeah,
fraudulent statistics.
no, I agree with that. They fudge the data, but even if they haven't fudged the data and it was a hockey stick, it's completely irrelevant that the CO2 has also gone up. It's like saying the number of bald people in the planet has gone up, so that's why we have climate change.
No,
Like, it's
exactly. Well,
unrelated.
exactly. And actually, remember that they have this IPCC thing where they say, well, we got all these thousands of no, they got thousands of climate scientists who are all publish or perish in universities, and guess who gives you money for climate science? Just the government. And the governments have all bought onto this UN thing. And so these
Well,
people have
yeah,
to toe the line. And we actually know the independent climatologists and geologists have said there's no question from the fossil record, from the ice cores, and from examining rock deposits that millions of years ago, we've seen all the patterns here. What happens is you have different solar cycles of the sun, and every once in a while, you get a real hot spell of solar radiation that lasts for decades or hundreds of years. And what happens is that causes all the plants to grow faster. You get a whole bunch more greening of the planet, which produces more CO2. And get this, 400 to 800 years later, because it turns out the ocean grabs
a
that
little
CO2
delayed. Yeah,
and then
yeah.
it releases it. So it's 400 to 800 years later. So it's actually the sun causes the temperature to go up, and then 400 to 800 years later, CO2 goes up. It's not the reverse. They're saying that, oh, CO2 is going up, that's causing the temperatures to go up. No, that's not supported by science. It's completely bunk, and it's propaganda, and it's really sad that people believe it.
Right, but they don't just it's not just that they believe it like you and I believe 1 + 1 is 2. It's like a religion to them. So if you say what you just said, you're offending their religion and they go insane. I
Well,
don't even argue with these people anymore.
yeah, yeah. Well, you know what it is it's essentially um, trauma-based mind control, because when you put the fear of death into somebody, which is what they
Yeah.
did in COVID, okay? Well, they also put the fear of death in people about this climate thing. They said that we're basically going to have, complete desertification of Western Canada. They won't be able to grow food. We're going to see the ice caps melt, and then we're going to see the water levels go way up and start drowning the coastlines. There won't be enough food. It's going to be the end of humanity. And you put the fear of death in people, and you repeatedly do that, you're abusing them psychologically. You're creating what's called psychological trauma. And once people believe in that trauma, it's like if someone's been in an accident, a really bad car accident, and they had injured really badly, and it took months to recover in the hospital. Whenever they see that particular kind of car or that particular kind of truck in a kind of a similar situation, they are triggered and they go right into all this super fear, right? It's post-traumatic stress disorder. What they've done with this heavy mind control is they've actually created this in people. The same reaction you're talking about with the climate change. If you go to somebody who's really invested in the vaccines, and you say to them, well, look, I've got some bad news for you. It turns out that the vaccines actually did not prevent transmission, nor do they even prevent infection. In fact, and this thing about reducing hospitalization, sorry, that's false too. Oh, and by the way, it causes turbo cancer, and also it actually gets into your genes. It turns out this SV40 thing is known called oncogen, and actually you're at much greater risk of dying now. In fact, the more jabs you have, the more COVID you're going to get too. So you try and say 5% of what I just said to someone who's completely into that space, and they're watching the CBC every day, and they're following all these, they will just, I mean, how many of us have lost friends, even family members who won't talk to us, right? That shows you that it's a trauma-based mind control going on, where they can't even look, because again, I was telling you about this KGB and the CIA in the 60s. They found out that once you had repeated this fear messaging and they were socially isolated, that they would believe it so badly that they will not even look at new information anymore. That contrast, that they will turn away, they don't even want to look at it. So that's what's happened. These people have been abused. They've been abused by our governments, letting the media play the role of doing it. Don't forget, the media is part of this. And then all
Yeah.
those paid off social influencers and those paid off Hollywood actors and those sports people. And, they were abused. And it's a really sad, tragic thing. Not unlike in the Spanish flu in 1918, half the people who died, by the way, that whole thing was a setup as well, but half the people that died from bacterial pneumonia from wearing cloth masks, right? So that's absolutely true. It's for the record that this is provable. And
Matthew,
yeah,
how are you doing
anyway.
for time? We're 100 an hour and 5 minutes. Do you have
Yeah, yeah.
time?
Oh, yeah. I'm fine, but I mean, I know your show is an hour, but I mean, whatever you.
No, it's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I'm enjoying this, but I have a question.
yeah.
Were you educated through a public education system or classical education?
It was public, but I mean, my father was a sociologist, and I said like social scientist, right? So he was, somewhat of an intellectual, and it was really important to him that we learn to critically think, and he'd tell us stuff like, I was like 8 years old, and I remember one day he said, because I like to take baths, and he got me these two boats, and one had a pirate's flag, and the other one had a Union Jack, like it was the British flag or whatever. And he showed me, look, Matthew, you see, this pirate ship is coming in really close. He wants to come in close because he's going to attack the British ship. So here's what we're going to do. They're going to change this flag. We're going to put on top of the pirate flag the British flag. See, and that way the other boat is going to think they're British, and then they can come in really close. And look at this. Now they can attack and take over. Matthew, this is a false flag. You have to understand this is called a false
Oh,
flag. I want you to remember this for the rest of your life, right? So I remembered it, and it's kind of a twist on what a false flag is, but the basic principle is there. And so yeah, he taught me things that helped me, later in life, right?
no,
Um,
that's good. The reason I asked that, I was in a public education system, and when you meet people that are either classically educated or they've actually read philosophy,
mhm,
it's like they run circles around you, and in a good way.
mhm.
So if I was going to rebuild society from the ground up in the education system, I'd be like, you know what? Forget numbers, forget science, forget history. Let's start
History.
with teaching them philosophy, and then
Yeah,
history,
philosophy,
English. Yeah,
absolutely, and logic,
yeah,
Aristotelian logic,
yeah.
how to actually
Thank you,
argue.
Aristotelian. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that I did that in university. That was really cool, and I was also really into debating and stuff, and but I mean also doing lefty sociology. I had to read Karl Marx in sociology, and it was really funny because I was a hacker, an ethical hacker, university, and got into a bit of trouble though. And my hippie libertarian professor was a libertarian, and he helped me and my friend, advice on how to, avoid getting in trouble at school with this problem that we hacked in the computer. And he made me read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And him and his wife were Peter Worthington supporters in Toronto, and when he ran for office, and they were libertarians. And they used to argue with me because I was so full of socialism, and they just argued the heck out of me. And I could just name ideology, and they had facts, and I was
Yeah.
just devastated each time. And so I was very fortunate that I ran into a lot of people that influenced me. That But it wasn't until really later in life that I got out of my profession, and there's a story behind that. But anyway, and seeing what happened with this COVID thing, that it was like I never thought in my lifetime I'd see anything like this. Like this, obviously, these people have been planning this for decades and decades. In fact, it goes back to Canada, Pierre Trudeau, right? He signed on to the first thing to do with this, the globalist UN thing. And then there was Brian Mulroney signed up another thing. And then, of course, there was Stephen Harper, and then Justin Trudeau. And of course, Chrystia Freeland, and both of them are from the World Economic Forum, Young Global Leaders Program. So we have this cluster of ideology now in government. And because of the CBC and the broadcasting of the mainstream media, people have been programmed to believe all this nonsense. It's really tragic.
I always say, roughly speaking, in Canada, it started in World War One, and it's just that every year or every few years it accelerates at an exponential rate. So
Yeah.
now it just seems like things are getting out of control. But like the War Income Tax Act and the
Right.
federal corporate tax the year before, the Income Tax Act was supposed to be temporary,
Yes.
but nothing is ever temporary with
Yes.
government.
Yes. And most Canadians don't know that central banking is a big problem with things, because we're on a debt-based economy. Speaking of which, well, everyone was really worried about not worried, but focused on Chrystia Freeland resigning and everything, and Trudeau obviously being pushed very hard to resign. The markets are doing strange things. I follow Gregory Mannarino on YouTube, and the federal funds rate and the 10-year Treasury rate are starting to converge. And if they actually converge, that's the point at which the liquidity disappears in the banks, and we get a freeze up. We get the debt market sell off immediately, just before the freeze up. The debt market sell off. All this financial stuff is all because of our central banking thing. And I don't know if you're familiar with Catherine Austin Fitts, but
Oh yeah.
she explains it all, that this taking down of the US dollar. I mean, the COVID thing fits into this in C-293, because if you want, the bankers realized, right, international bankers, that there's no way that the American government is going to be able to pay their entitlements in social services and stuff to the retiring baby boomers. So by 2030 or 2025 or something, they would be broke. So they said, they can't borrow any more money because they're already so high that they can barely pay the interest on the loans, on the debt. And so we're going to have to crash the US dollar. And that's what they've actively been doing. So all those buildings, like look at Canada, we spent $240 billion in 2021 and 2022, or just 2021, I'm not sure, remember? And we in the House of Commons, they were asked to go, you have 50 or 60 government departments here. Can you tell us exactly how much money you spent in each department? And they said, well, we can't actually, track it that carefully. We can't really know exactly what. So $240 billion disappears. They're paying people to stay at home and not work. I mean, when has that ever been done for a pandemic? First of all, it wasn't a pandemic, okay? The people that were dying were dying because of other illnesses, number one. And number two, because of the way that they were being handled. And you put people in a position where they're socially isolated, and you feed them fear propaganda, scare the hell out of them, and they're not getting the right food, they're not getting sunshine, and then compromised or
Nope. I think the CIA finally shut us down. Matthew, I'll give it a few more seconds, but if it crashed, I'm okay with it. It was a good episode.
Okay, so
Oh, you're back? You're back.
I'm back.
All right.
Yeah. All right. We should wrap up. Looks like we were.
Yeah, like I always joke, like when I get along with people and we agree, I say, if we I don't know if you can hear this, but if we had a drinking game where we took a shot every time we agreed, we'd die of alcohol poisoning. I don't know if you heard that. Nah, joke wasn't that funny anyway. Matthew. All right. Well, I'm going to officially end it. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Oh, Matthew, you're back?
Yeah, again.
I was just ending it. Let's just end it. We're having technical issues. So I wanted to thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And if you could quickly give a plug for anywhere that people can go and learn more about you.
Sure. The Stop C-293 Committee. That's what I want to draw people to. And again, that's on X. So you got to go on X, but it's really fun. You should be on X. That's where most of the world gets its news, including the mainstream media. So it's Stop, S-T-O-P, Stop, C-293, COMTEE. That's C-O-M-T-E-E. And if you go there, that's where we have our press release, which gives you a one-page summary where we actually quote the actual clauses in the bill, and it has the link at the top so you can actually look at the bill, and we tell you where the worst parts of this bill and why you should. This is your one-page Coles study notes for the bill, and we also have this weekly show where we interview people about this. And also there's a one-click thing, and the one-click thing is right at the bottom here. Stop C-293.ca. It's on our press release, which is also in that Stop 329C ComT account. And you click on that thing and you can send letters to your senators, and it's really literally 2 minutes, and you can hit like all 26 senators, 23 senators for Ontario, or 20 something for Quebec, I think 6 for Alberta, etc. So if I could get your folks into there, that'd be fantastic. And I'm also Matthew Pauly 13 on X. It's Matthew Pauly 13 on X. So thanks very much for interviewing me, Payman. I really enjoy your podcast. So thank you very much.
No, thanks for coming on. That was a super blast conversation. I thought it would be boring because it's late here, but man, it was really fun to have you on. Thank you very much.
You're a great interviewer. Thank you very much. Okay.
No worries. Take care and goodbye, everyone.
Bye bye.